Okay, what's up everyone? Shane, aka Wild Poker here, coming back at you with another review video for some 510 hands that I've played recently. Today's video is going to be two hands against the same guy, and yeah, let's get right into the action. So the first thing here, we were playing heads up for a little bit, starting the table, and he opened the button for min. I made it 85, pretty sizable 3-bet, just barely over 4x, and he called. And this is a little bit, I talked about this a little bit in my videos, is that one, we were really deep in a video and I recommended a bigger size 3-bet. And here, this is kind of essentially the same thing. When he makes it min and we call, it creates a much larger stack to pot ratio pre-flop, so it kind of makes it a little bit like we're playing deep versus, you know, instead of having him open to 3x, and us 3-betting to a size like 100 or something. So by him making it min, it basically creates a little bit larger stack to pot ratio going to the flop, so I ended up making a little more of a sizable 3-bet here as well. And I kind of wanted to show you guys a few things as to what I'm thinking about why I'm increasing the 3-bet size to maybe something that might be bigger than what a lot of people would use. And the first thing I wanted to show you is here is a hand that I've actually seen him call 3-bets with this size. Jack 8 off. Pretty poor hand, but you can see that it has this is a 3-bet range that I used for the PIO sim. My value hands being all the ones that are 100% here, and then you can see maybe these are considered value as well, but we're using a pretty linear range and just kind of mixing in a lot of this suited stuff, getting in some of the ace-x suited that can make the straights, and then also a tiny bit of pocket pairs, just occasionally 3-betting those so that we can make sure that we'll be able to have those sets in our range sometimes on different board textures. And yeah. My 3-bet range will certainly change against different guys, and you know, opponents who are folding way too much, we can get a lot more polarized. Opponents who are always calling regardless, we can, you know, adjust and just make it basically only our premiums. You know, we can do a lot of different things, but this is a good kind of potentially general 3-bet range against a guy who might be calling a little bit too wide, but one where we still have kind of some bluffs, but also all of our bluffing hands have good equity. And you can see here, against even our pretty strong, pretty linear range, like I said, the Jack 8 has 33% equity. And so my goal is to make a sizing where when he's calling with the Jack 8 off, or you know, any hands of that similar hand strength, that he's making a mistake. So if he does call, we don't really mind, but we've already forced him into a mistake pre-flop. And I guess, well, we'll get into this here. Over here, I did just a quick couple calculations here. The bottom one here is the sizing that I made. So you can see it was 65. The pot was his $20 plus my 85. So when you do the equation this way, it's risk divided by your risk plus the size of the pot, and that gives you your equity needed to call. And here you can see at the size that I made it, he needs 38% equity to make the call. And obviously when he has position, when there's playability post-flop, as long as he's not making any significant mistakes, or if I'm playing a little bit poorly in some spots, then he doesn't need quite this amount. Obviously he could make up for that a little bit with his position, but I don't think he can make up for it enough where Jack 8 off becomes a call. So if he is calling with those type of hands, that's great for us because we're actually already forcing him into a mistake before we even get to the flop. So that's kind of the reason why, one of the reasons why I want to start using this bigger sizing, is because everybody's current mentality these days, for the most part, is always defending against 3-bets, want to play tough against 3-bets, always calling in position. Calling ranges against 3-bets in position are just very, very, very wide right now. So by increasing our sizing, we get to start forcing people into making those mistakes. Here is the calculation for had I just made it 3x. So if I make it 3 times his raise size, he would have only had to call 40 because he made it 20, I made it 60. So the pot would have been 80 here. So 40 divided by 80 plus his risk gives us 33%. So you can see at that sizing, boom, we're actually allowing him to make a plus EV profitable call right off the get-go. And then with his positional advantage, it's probably going to be slightly even better than that. So just something to keep in mind when you guys are looking at the ranges of the players that you're playing against. If they're the type that are calling incredibly wide and just always trying to play in position against you, start forcing them into small mistakes. Or, well, first off, make sure that you're playing a range accordingly. That's going to be very important as well before you start just jacking up your sizing with your, if you're doing a completely polarized range, maybe work about on adjusting your range as well as your sizing. But I just wanted to throw that out there for you guys to look at and to think about. So we get to this flop here, and my thought on this flop was that although with my range we actually do connect pretty decent with this board, and the range advantage, he's not going to have like any kind of a huge range advantage against us. If anything, we might still be ahead. I still do think that on this board we want to be checking probably our entire range. Was my thought at the time. Excuse me. One reason is that I think this is a board texture that when we do start checking, people attack at a probably higher than they should frequency. And that's going to be good for us if we're checking our entire range, because now we have a lot of very strong hands that can combat against that. And then because we have all the strong hands, we can also mix in a good deal of bluffs with check raises and things like that. So I went for the check. He bets half pot and I called. And we'll look into whether actually the aces fall into the check raise range here. I thought that once we checked and he bet, going to be mostly calling with aces. And using our two pairs or sets and things like that as the check raise was kind of what I was thinking. We get to the turn, I check, he bets full pot, and at this point I think I did make a little bit of a mistake in the hand. I remember thinking that had I called, we were going to be left with a pretty small stack to pot ratio on the river, and at this point, if he was bluffing with things like flush draws, a 9, a 6, Jack Queen, all that type of stuff, that it could probably just give up on the river, given the fact that the pot was already going to be so big, and I had already called such a big bet on the turn, and there wasn't much going to be left to call on the river. However, after kind of looking at it again, let's say I had called, the pot would have been just a little over $1,020, and he would have had almost 800 left. So although it's not a huge bet on the river, it is still somewhat sizable, and there's probably a little bit more of a chance for him to have river bluffs than I originally thought. But at the time, I just thought probably almost never going to be bluffing the river, or if he is, it's a very, very low frequency. But I did at the time think he's going to have plenty of bluffs still continuing into this turn. And if that's the case, where there's a combination of he's got a lot of bluffs with good equity and they're probably not going to bluff on the river for us, then we just want to put the money in right now, charge his bluffs a price to see the river, or get them to fold. And so we ended up going all in here, and he called and did have the aces, and we were sad. But that was kind of my thinking in the hand at this point. So now we'll go into the pile solver. I've done a couple pile solver sims and a card winners EV thing to a little bit highlight what I was talking about on the turn with, if his bluffs aren't bluffing on the river or he's bluffing at a small frequency, what it does to our equity to call the turn here versus check raise all in. So we'll look into that as well. So first, let's get right into the end all be all of poker analysis, our PIO solver. So again here, like I said before, this is just the range that I put in for the PIO sim. Let you guys look at that for a second. And here's the range that I gave him. I gave him a pretty wide range. Like I said, I'd seen him call with Jack 8 off, but I don't know if that means that he's always calling with it. So I kind of just gave him a small percent of some of these things that I think he might call some of the time. And, you know, we're kind of playing a guessing game here, right, without me knowing his exact ranges. So I just kind of gave him some stuff out here, and then I'm sure some of this will 4-bet some of the time, but without being 100% certain, I just gave him all of those in there. And king and queens, we always have 4-betting, but we do have some slow plays with aces, and not necessarily slow playing with jacks, but I do think he's probably not always going to 4-bet the jacks. And the same with the ace-king suited, ace-king off, and ace-queen suited. So that's the range that we gave him here, getting to the flop. And you can see that we've given a whole bunch of different bet sizing options, raise sizes, etc. So let's get into it. So the first thing we want to do is look at our EV. We're 77 versus his 92. So actually in this case, he does have a, because of his positional advantage here and because of his the way the ranges interact, he actually has a pretty substantial EV advantage against us. We'll check the equities as well. And it's actually surprising. The equities of our ranges are actually running pretty darn close, but he's able to capitalize on the EV a little bit more. And I guess we can look at our range explorer here. And usually when you see such a large advantage, so our range, 6.6% of our range is 2-pair or better, and 9.6% of his range is 2-pair or better. So that's where it's coming from. Although we have our entire range has more equity, he's got a larger percent of his range that is really just crushing this board. So that's where we run into the problem there. So just wanted to double check that and show that. So kind of, but as expected, we need to be checking a very, very large percent of our range here. There's doing a little bit more betting than what I thought, and it's kind of mixing with a lot of different things to bet here. You can see we're even betting, you know, some of these very, very weak hands is kind of our bluffs, things like that. What I would recommend, and what I would recommend you look into, is instead of trying to mess around with this mixing of betting and, you know, betting different sizes and checking, just see what the difference is of checking your entire range. A lot of times when you go through PIO and you see that we're checking at such a high frequency like this, and there's nothing really that's just like a slam dunk bet for us, then we can end up just checking our whole range, and it's really not going to change these EVs hardly at all. Unfortunately, I didn't do that to check that, but that would be kind of the next step if you guys wanted to take that next step. Okay, so we check here, and for him in position, he's going to be betting a very, very wide range once we start checking. And you can see here we actually gave a 1/3 pot size bet in position, and that is by far the most favored bet size, just taking a stab once the out of position misses the bet. The half pot that our opponent uses almost never used, and then a like a 3/4 size pot is again never used as well. So really PIO was favoring betting a third pot with a large chunk of the range and then checking back some of it as well. So what I'm going to do is actually use this sizing for now. I did another sim where I gave PIO only this sizing option and then a pot on the turn. But what's going to happen is if I use this size, we're going to just run out of all of the combos of stuff. And yeah, we'll start here. And I think we'll get well, we'll look at one thing here. So when we bet 85, I do want to compare one thing. So I want to compare this check raise range with an 85 bet versus a 1/3 pot bet. And this is actually one thing that kind of surprised me when I was going through the sim here, is how high of a check raise percent we get when we've actually already bet a lot of the strong things. When PIO is checking, the range is definitely weaker than that portion of the range that was betting. So still, even after betting, even after checking, we're still able to find out a pretty high, almost 15% check raise range. And we can see that actually aces do fall in the check raise sometimes. The EVs run very, very close between check raising and check calling, and it's likely it actually doesn't even prefer the diamond. So it's just the EV of aces period is, or the equity of aces period is going to be pretty good here in this spot still. So it's okay to check raise sometimes, but definitely favoring the call. The check raise is going to be more going into our much stronger hands and then our much stronger draws. And then also a little bit of protection mixed in here as well. But anyways, against the half pot, we're check raising at this frequency. And then against the 1/3, we're getting almost to 20%. Another thing that was pretty surprising to me. So definitely want to make sure that against these stab bets, when we're checking out a position, that we are still, putting them to the test, not letting him get away easy by check calling, and we're really pretty aggressively finding a decent amount of check raises. Aces still mostly mixed in with a call here, but again, the EVs run pretty darn close. So check raising would have been an option. And I'll kind of let you guys look at that range for a second. All right. So we ended up calling, and the turn was the 5 of hearts. And then once we do check call, pretty much 100% of the time checking the turn. You can see here I gave a whole bunch of different bet sizing options. By far the most preferred is the bet pot on the turn after we check call. And then bet 2/3 pot was coming in second. The one thing we always want to do here is just check and make sure, if people are getting to the turn with this frequency, are they going to be able to continue betting this kind of range? Is there going to be more bluffs in the range, less bluffs in the range? We want to compare how we think our population or our opponents are doing compared to PIO. For me personally, I do think that people are probably going to be able to get pretty close to this. Some of the checks that we might see might be hands like Jack 10. I think people might tend to maybe check some of these 10s closer to 100% of the time. Some of the more aggressive opponents may continue to fire like your ace 10s all the time. And then there might be some opponents who get pretty close to this, but I do think that this might be one of the ones where we see more checks. I think all the 2 pairs are pretty easy. Straights are pretty easy. Maybe I think people can find these bluffs here because they're using one with a diamond as the most often. I think that's people are pretty aware of having, the flush blocker and, using that on flush rivers. So I think this is going to be easy. Ace 9 with the straight makes sense. Again, the diamonds. I'm guessing, this is going to be pretty low frequency in their range here. If we go to this, you can see, there's not a ton of combos of this one. But if they do get there, this might be some stuff where people. I guess people could turn this into a bluff still. Yeah, I'm not really seeing. I think my guess is that our opponents on average would probably get somewhere pretty close to this. Maybe the only difference would be some of these combos that I talked about, but there's still even people in the population that are going to be doing this as well. So I don't see any huge discrepancies, I guess is the main point. So let's go with the pot size bet. And our check raise range here, it looks like it wants to check raise queens a little bit more often than kings or aces for prior protection. You can see that the EVs of the combos that don't block any of his potential bluffs, meaning that don't have the queen of diamonds to block that bluff, are doing slightly better as a check raise all in for protection. Similar story with our jacks here. Tens obviously we have a set, so that's just going to be easy. Mixing in like these is kind of a bluff. And easy value. So not a ton of check raising going on here. You can see the aces. Actually, the combos that, again, don't block his bluffs are doing... There's still too big of a difference between check raising all in and check calling, so it's going to be... we do have a very small fraction of check raising all in, but very high prefer just check calling. And a part of the reason is when we get to the river, so let's say we call here, and the river is the king of clubs. We check. You can see that on the river, Pile Solver is continuing to bluff at a very aggressive frequency, and we go all in, and you can see that we are using some of our aces as a kind of aggressive bluff catch. And it's still even not all that great looking at the aces here with how aggressively, when we get back here, how aggressively Pio was bluffing. So a lot of the like the 9x here that missed, we're finding bluffs. It's turning the 8x that didn't have block any flush draws, or it was bluffing, you know, with the ace 8 spades, ace 8 of hearts. Those are continuing to bet. They're getting to the river at a very low frequency here, but if they did get there, they're going to be bet. These that bet the turn are continuing to bet. So, I mean, you can see that this might be a frequency. This is something that I didn't expect from our opponent at the time, is that when we did get to the river, wasn't quite sure if we were going to see many bluffs. I don't think we were going to see anywhere near maybe what Pio would be bluffing, but Queen Jacks here, King Jacks, Ace Jacks, Ace 9. I thought there might be some bluffs, but probably nowhere near this aggressive. So that's one thing to consider, is that we do have Pio here continuing to bluff pretty aggressively. And then the other thing, when we do see, so for example, like a jack, then we can easily fold the aces. Let's look here on the 6 of diamonds. We can actually fold our aces, be pretty okay with that. So we also are able to fold on the rivers that are very good for the out of position or the in position player as well. So that's another benefit of maybe just check calling there. and why we see the check call much more preferred as far as frequency than the check raise. So we finished that one. Now I'm going to go into the sim where it uses only the bet sizings that our opponent used and kind of forces us to only check call. And basically what we learned from the first one is that, you know, playing against PIO, playing against a player who's going to be bluffing very aggressively on the river and lost my train of thought. There's playing against someone who's going to be very aggressively bluffing the river. We need to just check call the aces to have an aggressive bluff catch for ourselves with the aces when we get to the river, and then also being able to fold. And that was kind of the main thing there. Okay, so on this one, what I did was I gave PIO only the bet sizing options that the opponent used, and then the river was all-in was the only option. I gave us a couple things. If you don't have PIO like being able to check raise, then what you see is like this bet size gets very wide because he never gets punished in position. So we do have to make sure to have the raise here, but we're always checking to him. And then I had a bet here because also there might be something where like if PIO checks back and we're never betting the turn, so he gets a free check back basically, then maybe it might get away with something. So we put in this as well, put in some bet size on the river, and yeah, everything else is the same. We just adjusted this and made it so that we're always checking out of position. However, you'll see here, this is not a good assessment of, you notice a big EV difference now. Equity's still the same, but there's a giant EV difference. This is not because we're checking 100% of the time. We changed a lot of the tree, so it's a accumulation of all those different things. So unfortunately, this is not going to be like, oh man, we actually drastically increased the EV by checking. We can't come to that conclusion. So just wanted to point that out. So here we're checking everything, and we do have PIO's betting 36.95% of the range. If we go to this option, you can see here when we were able to use the 1/3 sizing, we were betting 43% of the range. So we do have a pretty big difference here, but also keep in mind this is PIO, the out of position player, checking everything, so the checking range is also stronger. Another reason that we would want to reduce this as well. But still betting pretty darn aggressively here. And we actually see that because we've checked our entire range, we get to check raise quite aggressively here, because we have a stronger range at this point. And it's looking like aces actually can now, it's a little bit happier to check raise the aces than it was before, but still pretty darn similar. More preferring your queens and jacks, and 10x for protection, and then mixing in a lot of strong bluffs, and then our sets and two pairs that we have. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. The check raise range here gets quite aggressive. We were at about, before, when he was betting, when he had the option for a third pot or half pot, our check raise versus half pot was about 15%, and now it's jumped all the way up to 26.7%. So keep in mind, guys, when you're checking your entire range in these spots, because your range is so much stronger at that point, when you're facing the bet, you can check raise very aggressively. Here we ended up calling 5 of hearts on the turn. Obviously, we're always checking. And very similar percentages to what we saw in the first example. And again, probably not going to be too difficult to make this. We do see that these now go to almost 100% check. So slightly tighter as far as the protection goes, because the only bet sizing option is the full pot here, after betting a half pot on the turn instead of a third pot. And still able to find a decently aggressive check raise all in range. You could see that in this scenario, the aces that don't have the diamond are actually doing quite a bit better, almost the same EV to check raise all in as just check calling. And we are running into one of the things that's happening now is the size of the pot has grown quite a bit bigger. So there's a little more value in just getting the money in right now, I think, is kind of what's happening. And the ranges have changed slightly. But actually, as far as like the things that we're value owning, there's less of that being in. There's less combos of ace 10, less combos of king 10, and roughly the same from what I'm seeing here of bluffs and not really any. I don't think there's any slow plays that would make it better for us. So, I mean, actually, against this range, we're doing probably slightly worse to check as far as like the equity that our aces are going to have. It's probably slightly worse, but we are looking at a substantially bigger pot here. So I think that's where it's coming from, where it's getting a little bit better. So that's a little bit, that makes me a little bit happy about the check raise there on the turn. I was a little bummed initially when we first saw the first sim and the check raise. There was a pretty big gap between the two, between the option to check raise and check call. So at least I wasn't totally crazy, but still it looks like check calling is definitely the much preferred option. Oops. Call. King of clubs. We're checking. And again, we see PIO continuing to bluff very, very aggressively. When we get to the river, betting much more often than checking back. And we're just going to be very, very aggressively bluff catching here. And you can see it's very, very marginally plus EV call here with the aces when we get to this river. But making this small plus EV call is better than folding, so we're going to be calling with it. Let's look at a couple other options. We looked at a jack of clubs. Much more folding going on. In fact, always folding here. And kind of the same story. Okay, so there's that. Went through both of those sims just to show you some of the differences between. I think one thing we actually should notice is that the sizings that our opponent chose, the pot size on the turn seems pretty darn good. The half pot on the flop is definitely not preferred by PIO. We're looking at a 1/3 sizing, seems much, much better, and using it pretty aggressively. So something to keep in mind in your guys' games if you're only using a half size pot. Or a half pot size bet, then maybe start looking at implementing that 1/3. Okay, so here's the next thing I wanted to show you guys is kind of what I was talking about when if he is calling with, or on the turn, if he's betting all of these bluffs that are just going to give up on the river, then it's often just a little bit better for us to just get it in on the turn. And charge him a fee for seeing the river with those bluffs. Usually, I think at the sizes that we had left, if he did call with them, it's going to be minus EV for him, so we're actually forcing him into a mistake if he does call. But if he folds, we still deny him some equity, and it increases our equity a little bit as well. So first off, we always want to compare. I got all the pots and everything correct, so basically on the turn, we're checking, he's betting pot. If we call and the river goes to check down, this is kind of our what do you want to call it? This is kind of our baseline that we want to look at, and we always want to kind of try to beat this scenario. So our EV is 254.65 with our pocket aces, and the next one, and this one is somewhat unlikely because he's going to have a bunch of hands that value bet on the river, and we might decide whether we need to check call or check fold or things like that. But we do want to just start at this point and see if we do get to check down, what is our EV on the turn for just making this call. So the next thing I wanted to look at was if we check raise all in and we go up to 258, so we slightly improve on that. Here's the calling range is all of his overpairs are better, so this is all the stuff that beats us. The only thing that's we're beating here is the pocket jacks, but I do think if he's betting the turn there with the jacks, he's probably never going to fold. It's actually currently allowing him to call with all of these negative EV draws that he could be betting. All of his nut flush draws are even negative EV, except for the ones that have a gut shot as well. So right now it's allowing him to call with 100% of the things that he bet on the turn, even the stuff that's crushing us. So one thing I wanted to show is if he does fold that, let's say he plays perfectly after he bets, we get kind of crushed here. So in order to improve on the EV of the call check down line, we actually need him to make a mistaken call. And I do think that likely the nut flush draws, if they are betting, are always going to call. So we'd probably be somewhere around here. Who knows what he's going to do with like the straight draws that don't have a flush draw or anything when we check raise. So we're looking at something like this. Still worse than this, but like I said, this isn't really a realistic scenario all that often. So now let's go to something a little more realistic. We call, we get any river. Here's the one scenario where he always bets a set or better, and we call if we hit a set. So like we hit the river and he values himself with his set. So actually we get to improve because we in that one scenario, and then we still get value on against all of his straights. And you can see here in this case we jump back up to pretty darn close to the check down scenario. It was 254 for the check down river, 252 here. So we're quite a bit better in this line when we actually get to fold the river some of the time than just check raising the turn. But now I want to start looking at if he starts to bluff. And we are expecting here, or we're knowing that he's not going to bluff enough that we want to check raise, check call aggressively. But he is still going to bluff some. Whoops. And you can see very, very quickly we get close to, well, first off, if he's bluffing 100% and we're folding, we're making a terrible mistake on the turn. And this is where you can see Pile Solver actually starting to, in these ranges here, Pile Solver is pretty aggressively bluff catching. But this is kind of the scenario where we're talking about here. Somewhere in these much smaller ranges where his bluffs that missed are finding bluffs on the river. And you can see if he's bluffing 15% on the river, we're actually much lower than if we just check raised on the turn. If he's bluffing in between 10 and 15%, we're basically, so probably somewhere like 11% is right around the check raise all in line. If he starts getting a little bit over that, then we're actually under the check raise all in line and reducing our EV on the turn. So if I guess the key takeaway here is if we know that he's never bluffing, we're 100% certain that he's never bluffing, then obviously the check call turn, check fold river line is going to be the best. But if we have any level of uncertainty, well, first off, we know he's bluffing on the turn. We know he has these bluffs on the turn, but we're not sure what he's going to do with them when we get to the river, and we suspect that there might be a small percent of bluffs, but probably not enough for us to know that we need to check call. So we're going to be still very likely having a check fold on the river. We do much, much better by just aggressively check raising on the turn and putting all of those bluffs into a tough spot. And that's kind of what this is highlighting here, where once he gets to 15%, we've actually pretty substantially reduced our EV on our turn line from this here, which, sorry, we want to go to the most pessimistic scenario where he's playing perfectly. Wrong one. From this here. So we go from a 226 EV down to a 213 just because he's now started to bluff that 15%. And if he makes a mistake here on the turn and calls with his flush draws, then we've actually increased our EV. And this is probably going to be actually the best we're going to be able to do against that player type. So this is kind of an exploitative adjustment that also doesn't allow us to make mistakes on the river against a range where we have a somewhat of an idea, but we're not certain. So that was kind of my thinking on the turn. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. As always, if you have more questions on that one, you can throw them in the comments. And I know recently in my last couple of videos I've been really slow to get back to comments. I'm going to try to get better with that, but this past month, almost the entirety of my focus has been on just grinding, and pretty much from when I sit down on the computer until I get up, I'm playing poker, and once I finish my session, I can't look at my screen anymore, so I get up and I walk away, and it's been pretty difficult for me to do things like social media or responding to my YouTube comments. So I apologize to you guys for that. If you have commented on any videos recently and I haven't gotten back to you yet, I apologize, and I'm going to try to get better at that. That's one of my things I'm working on. But ask the questions. Even if I don't get to you right away, I definitely will read it, and I definitely will give you the best possible response that I can. So I think we covered this aces hand pretty well, and I don't think there's much more to talk about that one. So we're going to go on to the next hand here with the king queen, again against the same guy. This time we had, so these hands are in order. I had built up my stack a little bit and lost it to him with the aces hand, and then we built it back up to where I was at about 2,300-ish or somewhere around there. And again, we shipped it back over to him. So anyways, I'm opening here in middle position. He calls in the cutoff. And again, we get a flop texture when we're 200 big blinds deep out of position. This is something that I wasn't quite sure of, and I'm pretty happy that I went through the sims for this one. I do know that on this board texture, we definitely have a range advantage. We have all the sets. We have almost the same amount of flush draws, but we have some of the stronger ones with like the ace-queen suited that he's likely three-betting, ace-jack suited type stuff. He can't have kings. He can't have aces. He doesn't have, queens, jacks very often as well. So I do know that we have a range advantage here, but we're very, very deep out of position. And if this board starts running off where it's, you put a 4 out here, a 7 out here, type stuff after I bet, it's going to be very hard for me to combat against, I think, the improvement for his range. So because of that, I was unsure of whether we could bet or we needed to just check our whole range, and again, just have a stronger, much stronger checking range here on the flop. So I ended up checking, and he bet 60. I call. I think that's pretty standard and easy. I guess we could consider check raising here as well. So we'll look at if we do check, if we're check raising the king queen, or just check calling with it. But again, I just wanted to have a pretty strong get to turn range, and having hands like this when we do get to the turn definitely improves that strength quite a bit. Turn, check, check. So we're feeling pretty good. Whoops. On the river, I go for a small block bet. I do think that on the turn here, he's definitely capable of betting pocket tens, pocket nines, hands like 6, 7. A lot of one pair hands here that are below the king, but are still trying to bet for protection or whatever. I definitely think that even though we bet pretty big, this guy's capable of doing that type of stuff. And I also thought that it was somewhat unlikely that he had an ace. If he did have an ace, it was going to be usually probably a smaller, like an ace 5 or somewhere around that range that was checking back to try to get the showdown against my potentially stronger aces. But when he checked back the turn here, I actually felt that the strongest hand he could have would be something like pocket tens here. King 10 would definitely be a possibility. Something like that. So because his range was going to have all those really small pocket pairs and even some weaker king X, king 9, king 8 suited type stuff, I was just going for a small block bet here for value. And when he raised, I pretty quickly eliminated it in my mind. It would have been very hard for him to have a flush. I guess queen jack could have been possible, but a lot of times the queen jack can continue to barrel the turn. I think actually in my mind queen jack was probably more likely as a check back for him than a flush. So I guess that could have been possible. But we do have the nut flush blocker, and we did have the queen jack blocker as well. So I really, with those blocker potential and the fact that, like king 10 and pocket tens are pretty possible, I went for the re-raise here. And, repping. This is a line, this small block bet here is a line that I actually take somewhat often with my nuts in spots where I do think people's ranges are pretty capped, and I might have taken a line similar to this where my range looks potentially weak as well. I do have a decent chunk of small bets like this with my nut flushes or with my queen jacks. I would be having sometimes do this as well, so we're not going to be unbalanced here. Yeah, we ripped in a pretty big bet, and he did wake up with a flush. We actually got him to time bank down to like his last 1 second. So maybe sometimes he would have even clicked fold here with a flush that he had, which I think would have been a pretty big score for us. But one thing I do want to say that I regret doing is leaving myself with over $1,000 here. I think that psychologically, people notice that even if they're not really paying attention to it. I think if I would have made it 1,200 or like even 1,300 and given me just under $1,000 where it doesn't look like I'm trying to save that benchmark of having over $1,000 in chips or something like that, maybe we might have netted a little bit more fold equity. That's kind of like like I said, a small psychological thing that sometimes used to use a lot in heads up, or would use against other players when it looked to me like they were maybe trying to save their profits for the day, where they were betting an amount that didn't put them into the negative on the day. I might have been a little more likely to bluff catch. I mean, obviously that's very low down on the list of things that you're going through on your checklist of whether you should bluff catch or not, but sometimes it's that small difference. So something that kind of I was bummed that I didn't do when I was looking at this hand history again, because really we're not risking really all that much extra relative to how much we're risking already, but it might have just netted us maybe extra point or two of full equity, which could have been pretty nice here. So I wanted to talk about that for a second before we get into the Pile Solver Sims. Okay, here. So looking at my range is going to be something like this. And his range, again, we just kind of messed around with a bunch of stuff. All the stuff that's at 0.85 here or 0.5, I think that he might 3-bet some of the time. I think he 3-bets these all the time, and then we've just got kind of a mix of everything. So again, not 100% certain, but something that I think could be reasonable. And first thing we want to check our EV here. He's EV, so we're definitely crushing him. Pretty big equity disadvantage. This was the first thing that just really, really surprised me, is that out of position, even being this deep, if we give ourselves the 1/3 bet sizing option, we just use it with our entire range. There's pretty much no reason to even check here, and I think if you took all these checks and put it into, because there's no hand that it's just checking a little bit of everything just to kind of balance. So if we just 100% bet this 1/3 pot, I think we would be doing very, very close to the same. So this was really surprising to me. It tells me that when we have so much of a range advantage on the flop, even when stacks are deep and we're going to be able to be put in tough spots on turns and rivers, at the flop, when we have that range advantage, we need to be putting in that bet, and we could be putting in that bet with our entire range. So this was kind of a good learning point for me, in that I thought that the stack depth going into the turn and river was going to override a lot of our range advantage and make us want to check a lot. And here we're seeing that that's definitely not the case. So I made a clear mistake by not betting on the flop. So let's say we check here. It looks like PIO is recognizing the range advantage that we have, and that's why you're seeing this check back at a very, very high percent. So I didn't give him quite the bet size that he used, but it looks like if it does bet, it's a little bit bigger. And obviously 9-10 hearts is going to be fitting into a big bet size if it is going to be bet. And another thing, like I said, that I wanted to check, if we do check, do we check raise? And the answer is no. We're always check calling once we check. But obviously, sorry, wrong button. We're just very, very rarely getting here, but we are getting here with a little bit of everything in our range. Makes it this far. So still check calling. Checking. So you can see here another time in the first hand, we saw that once we get to the turn, PIO doesn't like to use this 1/3 pot bet sizing in position after betting. It's preferring the 2/3 or a 1.5 overbet. And in the last hand, it was a full size pot or a 2/3 bet. But it's going more towards the big bets or checking once we get to the turn after the out of position is check called on the flop. And I think one of the big reasons is that the out of position check call flop range is just going to be weaker than the bet range or the check raise range. So we're favoring these bigger bets. Um, and you can see the equities have gotten a little bit closer here. So that's another reason as well. Again, because the range got weaker. So you can see here, pretty much all the flushes are betting. And then mixing in a decent chunk of bluffs. And again, we kind of want to check and make sure, is this something that people are going to be doing? I think it's reasonable. We kind of expected him to actually be checking back a lot of these. This right here is something that I guess a lot of people wouldn't do, betting these king 8s and king 9s. These are all flush draws and stuff like that. So maybe this is about it, but somewhat close, I think. And the thing that we see is like when it goes to the check range, here's where we're not going to really be able to analyze the hand much further, is because once it goes into the check, and we get the 10 of spades, the ranges are just so skewed. The first thing it wants me to do, the out of position player, is to now find a donk with a bunch of stuff at a pretty big sizing, but you can see here that I have almost no combos. So all of our value hands that got here, and then some bluffs, are donking pretty big, and then we're donking small for protection with our weak aces, and then the king, queen here, with the hearts, mostly just checking, but it looks like the EV of betting a block bet is pretty darn close. But the problem is, so we bet our small block bet. Like the ranges are just so skewed by the time we get to this point in the tree that it's really tough to analyze here. When we do, he's raising. So where are the bluffs coming from? Value. So we have this, like heart blockers with a jack as a bluff. These are flushes. The heart, any of the heart blockers with the queen or a jack as a bluff, which would mean that we actually king 10 is value. With our queen, we're actually blocking a lot of his bluffs, which is going to mean that from the perspective of PIO, if we're blocking the majority of his bluffs, because this is a big chunk of his bluffs, all these queen jack off, where you have the queen of hearts as well, and our king queen is blocking that. So if we do that and he raises, we can see that going all in is actually still going to be plus EV, because we're probably going to get a couple stronger hands to fold. And I would equate going all in here to being about the same as making the big chip raise that we did, as far as how it's going to affect our opponent's calling range. So maybe because we're risking less, we can actually increase the EV slightly, but you can still see here that we are actually doing okay to just call versus the raise, because we're going to be still beating enough of his potential bluffs. So yeah, this one's pretty darn hard to analyze, because one, I took a line that PIO would never take, and then two, our opponent took a line that PIO would never take. So we get into kind of a weird situation here, but I did want to get to the river, and kind of what I did was messed around a little bit with the ranges here and seeing if we could find a little bit more of a line that we took, if there's a range that it would ever be appropriate to take the line that we took on the river. And the first one is I kind of made a guess at what his range would actually be like based on the fact that he showed up with 9-10. So I still actually left him with some of his aces 2 pairs. I got rid of like the stronger ones here. We still gave him, like I said, he could still have some of these pocket pairs here. We gave him a little bit of this. I did still give him the flushes, but you can see he only has them half the time, so sometimes you bet him on the turn, sometimes you didn't. But we're still giving him a decent chunk of all of his flushes as well. And my range is basically the same. It's just, yeah. Okay. So we're on the river. And again, preferring a 1/3 block bet. And again, we can see here that the king queen with the queen of hearts is block betting. First off, we'll go to strategy here. Very, 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 very small fraction. Basically never, because the EV is less. Checking is going to be a higher EV against that range. We're still getting to the river with a lot of ace-x 2 pairs and flushes and things like that. So we should actually be checking. But let's see if we do block bet. He makes a big raise. And then here in this case, because of the way the bluffing range in the value range is going to work out, well, first off, let's see here. What's he calling with? So he's bluff catching with 9s. Like, that's something that PIO would never do. Or re-raising with 9s, re-bluffing with 9s, sorry. Jamming. Yeah, so the range gets super tight here. Finding these as the bluff, and then everything else is just flushes. And then I guess we flush. So I think if he has all these flushes in his range, his defense is just really easy to make. And I think that people would be maybe sometimes they fold some of these. But the problem is he just has too many flushes, too many strong hands to defend, and too many hands that are stronger than our king queen here for us to even want to block bet. We're just kind of valuing ourselves as the problem. And I think the main thing is that I personally never expected him to have all those flushes or 2 pairs or strong hands like that. Like I said, the strongest hand would probably be like king 10 or pocket 10s. So I definitely made a misread on his range at the time. And I think he took a line that, definitely a line that you shouldn't take, but a line that because he did take it, it led to me making a much bigger mistake than what I might have taken had he played more appropriately. So although I think he made a mistake, I think in his hand it worked out for him very, very well. So let's go back here. Look at his range here, and let's say he can't have any flushes. Okay, so we now have it to where he can't really have any flushes. Very, very little, but he can have some 2 pairs and stuff like that. Once his range gets quite a bit weaker, it looks like us betting a larger amount for value gets a little bit more appropriate. We still have a decent chunk of block bets as well. And you can actually see that now that he doesn't have all the flushes. So before, when he can't have flushes and a lot of 2 pairs and a lot of stronger hands, our king queen is too weak to even want to block bet. But now that he doesn't have those, the block bet actually makes a little bit more sense, which is kind of where I thought his range was going to be. So yeah, we take the block bet line, and PIO's finding a raise as a bluff with pocket 9s. It could still have pocket 6s in the range, so raising as a bluff or for value, not as a bluff, but for value, I think here. Mixing in the queen 8 as a bluff, blocking some of the straights, blocking some of the straight. So we do have a decent chunk of bluffs going on here. This will be a bluff, blocking some of my potential sets and straights. Here's for value. So he raises, and you can see the king queen here still still going to be I guess a fold. Can't even bluff catch here at this point just because his range got, I think, so much stronger, and the queen is just blocking his bluff so heavily. Looks like the queen of hearts with queen blocking any potential straights, and the nut flush really just wants to jam it in. That makes sense. And going pretty aggressively with the flushes here. Like, I think a lot of people wouldn't put all the money in here with the 8-high flush. But again, PIO has the read here that he just doesn't have flushes. So I guess if you have that read, obviously it'd be pretty easy. So I think here, I guess the moral of the story is I was pretty off about our player's range, getting to the river range. Obviously, if he can show up with flushes here, even without him being able to show up with flushes, I think we still ended up making a mistake and just putting in too much money on the river here with a hand that didn't need to. I think the easiest thing to do for us, if we don't think he can have flush, is just block bet and fold to the raise. Just realizing that his most likely value hands here are king 10 or pocket 10s, and I'm not quite sure yet if this guy's like a recreational player. He does definitely some awkward things and some odd things, but I don't know. What I was going to try to say is, like, trying to get a recreational player to fold a set or a river 2 pair, I think is in the long run just going to be a losing play. So I think I just kind of put too much emphasis on, hey, I have the blockers, let's make a big re-raise and put him to the test, when I think we could have just made this $70 bet and kind of been done with a hand at that point. And I think PIO supports that quite a bit with all the different trees that we saw. We did see that in the full one that, check calling here on the river somewhat aggressively is a decent option as well, when he's going to be able to have quite a bit of bluffs and we do block some of his flushes. So that would have been another option. All in all, I think right now for me as well, I do think I'm putting a little bit too much emphasis on having the nut blockers and always finding a way to make a big bluff with it on the river. We're very often finding a way to make a big bluff with it on the river. But looking at this, we just need to be, again, more careful about what our opponent's range is, what they're going to be raising here with, and what they're going to be folding after this raise. Yeah, so definitely some good takeaways for me as well here, and hopefully there was some good stuff in there for you guys as well. That will be video number 2 of my 5-10 series. Hopefully put out another video within a week or so, and until then, see you guys next time.